Welcome! Do you ever feel it? That subtle friction, that quiet resistance between the person you know yourself to be in your most private moments and the person you are often required to be by the world outside? It is a sense of being slightly out of sync, as if the costume you wear, tailored by societal expectations, career demands, and social roles, does not quite accommodate the full expanse of your inner life. We navigate a world that asks us to be definable, predictable, easily categorized. We are given labels, encouraged along certain paths, measured by metrics of success and normalcy. Yet sometimes a profound question echoes in the stillness. Is this framework large enough? Does the reality presented to us, a reality often focused on material gain, social status, and conforming to the latest trends, truly encompass the depth and potential of human existence? Is there not something within us that strains against these confines? Something that hints at a reality far richer, far more complex, perhaps even infinite? If this sentiment resonates, you have encountered the central tension explored with unparalleled depth by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. He lived and wrote in the 19th century, yet his insights into the struggle for authentic selfhood in the face of societal pressure feel startlingly relevant today. In this video, we will explore his radical and ultimately empowering message. You are vastly more than this world typically acknowledges or allows. Kierkegaard observed his contemporary society, particularly the rise of the press and anonymous public opinion, with growing alarm. He saw the emergence of what he called the public, or the crowd, not simply as a collection of individuals, but as a monstrous abstraction, a phantom force that encouraged conformity and discouraged genuine personal existence. The crowd, he argued, fostered a leveling process, grinding down uniqueness, passion, and personal responsibility. In the anonymity of the crowd, individuals could avoid the difficult task of forming their own convictions, making decisive choices, and taking responsibility for their lives. Instead, they could drift along, adopting ready-made opinions, chasing fleeting trends, and seeking validation from the faceless masses. The world, dominated by this spirit of the crowd, offers a tempting but ultimately soul-crushing bargain. It promises comfort, security, and belonging in exchange for your unique individuality. It encourages you to define yourself by external markers: your profession, your possessions, your social connections, your adherence to the prevailing norms. Fit in, play the assigned role, do not cause trouble, and you will be accepted. But the cost, Kierkegaard passionately argued, is the loss of one's true self, the abandonment of the potential for authentic existence, and a disconnection from the deeper, eternal dimension of being. This disconnection, this state of being alienated from one's essential self, is what Kierkegaard diagnosed as despair. For him, despair was not simply an emotion like sadness, but a fundamental sickness of the spirit, a malady rooted in the very structure of the self. It arises because humans are complex beings, a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. When we attempt to live solely within the finite, denying or ignoring the infinite dimension within us, despair inevitably results. It is the condition of being spiritually ungrounded, lost to oneself. Kierkegaard identified several ways this despair manifests. There is the despair of weakness, where an individual is unwilling to be the unique self they are meant to be. Overwhelmed by the burden of freedom and responsibility, they seek escape through constant distraction, immersion in sensual pleasure, or complete conformity to the crowd. They avoid commitment and decisive choice, leaving their self undeveloped and fragmented. Then there is the despair of defiance, where an individual wills to be themselves, but defines that self purely in finite, worldly terms. They might build their identity on their own power, intellect, or achievements, rejecting any notion of dependence on something higher or eternal. This defiant self-assertion, grounded solely in the finite, ultimately leads to despair when confronted with the inherent limitations of the world, such as suffering, failure, and mortality. Perhaps the most common form, Kierkegaard suggested, is the despair of ignorance. This is the condition of being in despair without being conscious of it. The individual lives within the accepted norms of society, mistaking comfort for fulfillment, numbness for peace. They are spiritually asleep, unaware of their alienation from their deeper potential and their eternal grounding. They live lives of quiet desperation, lacking even the awareness of their own spiritual predicament. Kierkegaard's aim in diagnosing these conditions was not to induce gloom, but to awaken individuals to their true situation and the possibility of a more authentic existence. The path out of despair begins with understanding the true nature of the self, something the world often obscures. The human self, for Kierkegaard, is not a static entity, but a dynamic task. It is the task of relating two sets of opposing factors, the finite versus the infinite, and the temporal versus the eternal, all within the context of necessity versus possibility. The finite includes our specific circumstances, our body, our historical context, our limitations. The infinite encompasses our capacity for reflection, imagination, freedom, and our connection to the transcendent. The temporal relates to our existence in time, our development and mortality. The eternal relates to that dimension of the self, connected to timeless values, ultimate meaning, and for Kierkegaard, God. Necessity covers the given aspects of our existence we cannot change. Possibility covers our freedom to choose, to act, to shape our future and ourselves. An authentic self is actively engaged in the task of holding these poles together in a passionate, conscious synthesis. The self is this very relation, actively relating itself and to the power that established it. Despair is the result of a misrelation in this synthesis, often caused by the world's relentless pull towards the finite, the temporal, and the necessary, encouraging us to forget or neglect the infinite, the eternal, and the possible. To illuminate the journey towards authentic selfhood, Kierkegaard described three spheres of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. These are not rigid stages one must pass through sequentially, but fundamental modes of living, representing different ways of prioritizing values and understanding existence. Movement between them requires a decisive commitment, a leap. The first sphere is the aesthetic. The aesthetic life is oriented around immediate experience, pleasure, novelty, and the avoidance of boredom and binding commitment. The aesthete lives for the interesting moment, guided by impulse, mood, and sensory gratification. Think of the romantic pursuing idealized love but shying away from actual commitment. The intellectual who endlessly analyzes possibilities without ever choosing one. Or the modern consumer constantly seeking the next product, experience, or digital distraction. The aesthete avoids choices that entail long-term responsibility because commitment limits future possibilities and introduces the risk of repetition, which they dread. While potentially exciting, the aesthetic life ultimately leads to despair because it lacks a stable core. It is dependent on external stimuli, which inevitably fade or become boring. By avoiding defining choices, the aesthete fails to develop a coherent self, remaining fragmented and ultimately empty. The pursuit of endless possibility leads paradoxically to a state of profound meaninglessness and melancholy. This very despair can become the impetus for a leap into the next sphere. The ethical sphere represents a move towards commitment, responsibility, universal principles, and rational self-governance. The ethical individual chooses to define themselves through their roles, duties, and adherence to moral law. They embrace marriage, vocation, civic duty, and strive for consistency and transparency. Reason and universalizability are key values. Unlike the aesthete, the ethical person makes choices, takes responsibility, and builds a stable character through commitment. They find meaning in fulfilling their obligations and living according to rational principles that apply to everyone. Society typically values the ethical individual for their reliability and contribution to social order. The ethical represents a significant advance in selfhood over the aesthetic. However, Kierkegaard maintained that the ethical sphere is also insufficient for the highest form of human existence. Its limitation lies in its emphasis on the universal. While valuable, defining oneself solely through universal rules and social roles can lead to a suppression of one's unique, concrete individuality. One might become merely an instance of the general rule, losing touch with the specific, irreplaceable self. Furthermore, the ethical framework, based on human reason and universal norms, cannot fully account for the individual's potentially absolute relationship with the absolute, with God. There might arise situations, Kierkegaard posited, where an individual's duty to God transcends or even contradicts universal ethical obligations. This points beyond the ethical to the religious sphere. The religious sphere is entered through a leap of faith. Faith, for Kierkegaard, is not intellectual assent to doctrines based on proof, but a passionate, subjective commitment made in the face of objective uncertainty and paradox. The religious life centers on the individual's direct, personal relationship with the absolute, God. This relationship surpasses both the immediacy of aesthetic pleasure and the universality of ethical reason. Within this sphere, Kierkegaard distinguished between religiousness a more general religious consciousness involving feelings of guilt, suffering, and dependence on God, often mediated through established religion, and religiousness b, the religion of paradox and faith, exemplified by Abraham. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard analyzes Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac as the ultimate act of faith. This command from God stands in stark contradiction to all ethical reasoning. Abraham cannot justify his action rationally or universally. His commitment is solely to his personal relationship with God. He performs a teleological suspension of the ethical, where the universal ethical norm is suspended for the sake of a higher purpose revealed through faith. Abraham becomes the knight of faith, an individual whose absolute duty to God places him beyond the comprehension of purely ethical judgment. He lives fully in the finite world, yet his life is grounded in an absurd, paradoxical relationship with the absolute. This requires supreme passion, inwardness, courage, and the willingness to stand alone before God, embracing the absurd. It is in this intensely personal and subjective commitment that the individual fully actualizes their unique selfhood as a synthesis of finite and infinite, grounded ultimately in the eternal. This understanding underpins Kierkegaard's provocative claim that subjectivity is truth. He did not mean that objective facts are unimportant or that truth is merely relative. Rather, he argued that for the most crucial questions of existence, questions of meaning, value, faith, and how to live, the decisive factor is not the objective content of belief, the what, but the manner in which the individual appropriates that belief, the how. The passionate inwardness, the subjective commitment, the way one lives and relates to a truth is what constitutes its existential reality for the individual. Objective uncertainty, particularly in matters of faith, is precisely what makes passionate commitment possible and meaningful. If religious truths could be proven objectively, faith would be unnecessary. It is the risk, the leap beyond evidence, the passionate embrace of the uncertain, that defines authentic subjective truth. The world, with its preference for objective verification and public consensus, struggles with this idea. It favors knowledge over faith, detachment over passion, the crowd over the individual. But Kierkegaard insists that the path to becoming a true self requires moving beyond the subjective stance and engaging with existence with passionate, subjective concern. This entire process of becoming an individual is accompanied by angst, usually translated as anxiety or dread. Unlike fear, which has a specific object, anxiety is the fundamental state of unease arising from our awareness of freedom and possibility. It is the dizziness of freedom, the terrifying and exhilarating realization that we are not predetermined beings, but are radically free to choose who we will become, and therefore entirely responsible for our choices. Society offers countless palliatives for this anxiety: distractions, conformity, rigid ideologies, anything to make us forget our freedom. Kierkegaard, however, saw anxiety as an essential teacher. It is the awareness of our potential, the call to authentic existence. Embracing anxiety, learning from it, and acting courageously in spite of it is necessary for spiritual growth. Every significant choice, every leap, every act of resistance against the leveling tendency of the crowd involves confronting this fundamental anxiety. It demands the courage to be oneself, to choose singularity over anonymity, to risk misunderstanding, and perhaps to make the leap of faith into a relationship with the eternal that defies worldly logic. Let us return now to that initial feeling, that sense of being constrained, of being more than the world allows. Kierkegaard's philosophy offers a powerful lens through which to understand this experience. The world, operating primarily on the logic of the finite, the measurable, and the socially acceptable, inevitably seeks to diminish the individual's infinite dimension. It wants you to be a known quantity, a predictable element. It offers the anesthesia of conformity and consumerism to keep you from the demanding, anxiety-filled task of realizing your true self, the self that is a synthesis of finite and infinite, temporal and eternal. Your feeling of being more is not an illusion or a sign of discontent. It is an echo of your true nature. It is the infinite within you resisting reduction. It is the eternal dimension asserting its reality against the backdrop of the merely temporal. It is the call of possibility challenging the perceived finality of necessity. Kierkegaard issues a profound call to reclaim this more. This is not about rejecting the world entirely, but about refusing to let the world define the entirety of your being. It involves developing awareness of how the crowd and societal pressures subtly shape your thoughts, desires, and choices, and consciously choosing to resist mere conformity, recognizing the limits of a life lived solely for aesthetic pleasure or novelty, and embracing the self-defining power of commitment and responsibility found in the ethical sphere. Understanding the value of ethical principles while also remaining open to the unique demands of your individual conscience and your potential relationship with a reality that transcends the purely ethical or rational. Facing the anxiety of freedom not as something to be eliminated, but as the unavoidable companion to a meaningful, chosen life. Cultivating deep inwardness, focusing on the quality, passion, and sincerity of your inner life and commitments, rather than solely on external achievements or appearances. Considering the possibility of faith, not necessarily as adherence to dogma, but as a courageous, subjective commitment to meaning and value that may not be provable or universally accepted. A trust in the ultimate significance of your individual existence before the eternal. This is fundamentally a personal journey. Kierkegaard wrote for that single individual. There are no mass solutions, only individual paths forged through choice, passion, and courage. The world will persist in its attempts to level, distract, and define you according to its limited terms. Kierkegaard's work stands as a timeless encouragement to resist these pressures. Honor that intuition that tells you there is more to you and more to existence than meets the eye. Embrace the challenge, the difficulty, the anxiety, and the profound reward of becoming the unique individual you are capable of being. You are tasked with embodying a paradox, being fully in the world, yet grounded in something beyond it. You are, and must strive to fully become, infinitely more than this world, on its own, allows. Thank you for joining this reflection on the vital thought of Søren Kierkegaard. His challenges remain potent, urging us toward a life of greater depth, passion, and authenticity. May you find the courage to pursue your own path of becoming. Thanks for watching, and until next time, continue the journey inward.